Dear people watching and listening, kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Kindly support me through Patreon so that I can keep making such audiobooks for you. For your ease, the video has been divided into chapters which can be found in the description. Izharul Haq, The Truth Revealed by Maulana M. Rahmatullah Keranvi. This is the very book which empowered Sheikh Ahmed Deedat with the knowledge of the Christian scriptures, which enabled him to challenge the claims of the Christians on Islam, the divinity of Jesus Christ, and their own religion as a whole. The book, internationally recognized as one of the most authoritative and objective studies of the Bible, was originally written in Arabic under the title Izharul Haq by the distinguished 19th century Indian scholar Maulana Rahmatullah Keranvi and appeared in 1864. The book was subsequently translated into Urdu and then from Urdu into English by Muhammad Wali Razi. The present publishers are bringing the Wali Razi translation out as a series in several installments, of which this is the 3 parts put together. Maulana Rahmatullah wrote the book in response to the Christian offensive against Islam in British Indian, and specifically to counter the subversive attack made by the Reverend CCP founder, who had written a book in Urdu entitled Mizanul Haq, the open intention of which was to cast doubts into the minds of the Muslims about the authenticity of the Quran and Islam. Part 1. The Books of the Bible.
The New Testament and the status of the 4 Gospels. The Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and Mark. All the ancient Christian writers and a great number of modern writers are unanimous on the point that the Gospel of Matthew was originally in the Hebrew language and has been completely obscured due to distortions and alterations made by the Christians. The present Gospel is merely a translation and is not supported by any argument or authority. Even the name of its translator is not definitely known. There is only conjectures that possibly this or that person might have translated it. This kind of argument cannot be acceptable to a non-Christian reader. The book cannot be attributed to its author only on the basis of uncertain calculations. The Christian author of Mizanul Haq could not produce any authority regarding the author of this book. He only conjectured and said that Matthew might possibly have written it in the Greek language. In view of this fact, this translation is not acceptable and is liable to be rejected. The Penny Encyclopedia says regarding the Gospel of Matthew: this Gospel was written in the Hebrew language, and in the language which was in vogue between Syria and Chaldea in 41 AD. Only the Greek translation is available, and the present Hebrew version is only a translation of the same Greek version. Thomas Ward, a Catholic writer, says in his book, Jerome explicitly stated in his letter that some ancient scholars were suspicious about the last chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and some of them had doubt about some verses of chapter 23 of the Gospel of Luke, and some other scholars were doubtful about the first 2 chapters of this Gospel. These 2 chapters have not been included by the Marcionites in their book. Marcionite school is a sect of Christianity. They do not acknowledge the books of the Old Testament as genuine. They do not acknowledge the books of the Old Testament as genuine. They believe in 2 gods, the creator of good and the creator of evil. To them, the books of the Old Testament are the books sent by the second God. The chapters in the books of the New Testament which contain references to the books of the Old Testament, are either rejected or altered by them. The founder of this sect was Marcion. Norton writes in his book printed in 1837 in Boston, "This Gospel contains a passage running from verse none to the end of the last chapter, which calls for research. It is surprising that Griesbach has not put any sign of doubt about its text, since he has presented numerous arguments to prove that this part was an addition by some later people." Later in his book, giving some arguments, he said, "This proves that the passage in question is doubtful, especially if we keep in mind the habit of writers in that they usually prefer to add to the text rather than to omit from it." Griesbach is one of the most reliable scholars of the Protestant faith. The inauthenticity of the Gospel of John. There is no authority for the claim that the Gospel of John in the book of the Apostle John, to whom it has been attributed. On the contrary, there are several arguments that strongly refute this claim. The first argument. Before and after the period of the prophet Jesus, the style of writing and the method of compiling books were similar to the style of the present Muslim writers. It does not appear from this Gospel that John was making his own statements. It is not possible to refute the obvious evidence which the text itself offers, unless strong arguments are presented to negate it. The second argument. This Gospel contains this statement in chapter 21, verse 24. "This is the disciple which testifieth of these things, and we know that his testimony is true," describing the Apostle John. This denotes that the writer of this text is not John himself. It leads us to guess that the writer has found some script written by John and has described the contents in his own language, making some omissions and additions to the contents. The third argument. In the 2nd century AD, when the authorities refused to accept this Gospel as the book of John, Irenaeus, a disciple of Polycarp, the disciple of John, was living. He did not make any statement to negate those who refused to accept the book, and did not testify that he had heard Polycarp saying that this Gospel was the book of John, the Apostle. Had it been the book of John, Polycarp must have known it. It cannot be the truth that he heard Polycarp saying many secret and profound things which he related, but did not hear a single word about a matter of such importance. And it is even more unbelievable that he had heard it and forgot, since we know about him that he had great trust in verbal statements, and used to memorize them. This is evident from the following statement of Eusebius regarding the opinion of Irenaeus about verbal statements. "I listened to these words with great care by the grace of God, and wrote them not only on paper, but also on my heart. For a long time I have made it my habit to keep reading them." It is also unimaginable that he remembered it and did not state it for the fear of his enemies. This argument also rescues us from the blame of refusing the genuineness of this Gospel from religious prejudice. We have seen that it was refused in the 2nd century AD, and could not be defended by the ancient Christian. Celsus, who was a pagan scholar of the 2nd century AD, fearlessly declared that the Christians had distorted their Gospels 3 or 4 times or more. This change of or distortion changed the contents of the text. Festus, the chief of the Manichaeans and a scholar publicly announced in 4th century AD, "It has been established that the book of the New Testament are neither the books of the Christ, nor are they the books of his apostles, but unknown people have written them and attributed them to the apostles and their friends. The fourth argument. The Catholic Herald, printed in 1844, includes the statement in Volume 3 on page 205 that Stapelin said in his book that the Gospel of John was undoubtedly written by student of scholar in Alexandria. See how blatantly he claims it to be a book of a student. The fifth argument. Berchiander, a great scholar, said, "The whole of this Gospel and all the epistles of John were definitely not written by him, but by some other person in the 2nd century AD. The sixth argument. Grotius, a famous scholar, admitted, "There used to be 20 chapters in this Gospel. The 21st chapter was added after the death of John by the Church of Ephesus." The seventh argument. The Elogin, a sect of the Christians in the 2nd century AD, disowned the Gospel and all the writing of John. The eighth argument. The first 11 verses of chapter 8 are not accepted by any of the Christian writers, and it will soon be shown that these verses do not exist in the Syriac version. If there were any authentic proof to support it, most of the Christian writer would have not made such statements. Therefore, the opinion of Berchiander and Stapelin is undoubtedly true. And the ninth argument. Horn in chapter 2 of volume 4 of his commentary says, "The information that has been covered to us by the historians of the Church regarding the period of the 4 Gospels is defective and indefinite. It does not help us reach any meaningful conclusion. The ancient theologians have confirmed absurd statements and written them down. Subsequent people accepted them just out of respect to them. These false statements thus were communicated from one writer to another. A long period of time has passed, and it has become very difficult to find out the truth." Further in the same volume he says, "The first Gospel was written either in 73 AD, or 38 AD, or in 43 AD, or in 48 AD, or in 61, 62, 63, and 64 AD. The second Gospel was written in 56 AD, or at any time after it up until 65 AD, and most possible in 60 or 63 AD. The third Gospel was written in 53 or 63 or 64 AD. The fourth Gospel was written in 68, 69, 70, or in 89 or 98 AD. The Epistles and the Revelation. The Epistles to the Hebrews, the second Epistle of Peter, the second and the third Epistles of John, the Epistle of Jacob, the Epistle of Jude, and several verses of the first Epistle of John are wrongly attributed to the Apostles. These books were generally supposed to be doubtful up until 363 AD, and continue to be considered false and unacceptable to the majority of Christian writers up until this day. The verses of the first Epistle of John have been omitted in Syrian versions. The Arabian churches have rejected the second Epistle of Peter, Epistles of John, the Epistle of Jude, and the Revelation. Similarly, the churches of Syria have rejected them from the beginning of their history. Horn says in the second volume of his commentary in 1822, on pages 206 and 207, "The following epistles and verses have not been included in the Syrian version, and the same was the case with Arabian churches. The second Epistle of Peter, the Epistle of Jude, both the Epistles of John, the Revelation, the verses from 2 till 11 of chapter 8 in the Gospel of John, and chapter 5, verse 7 of the first epistle of John. The translator of the Syrian version omitted these verses because he did not believe them to be genuine. Ward confirms this in this book written in 1841, on page 37. Rogers, a great scholar of the Protestant faith, has mentioned the name of a number of Protestant scholars who declared the following books as false and excluded them from the Holy Scriptures: the Epistles to the Hebrews, the Epistle of Jacob, the second and third Epistles of John, and the Revelation. Dr. Bliss, a learned scholar of the Protestant faith, stated, "All the books up until the period of Eusebius are found acceptable," and he insists on the point that the Epistle of Jacob, the second Epistle of Peter, and the second and third Epistles of John are not the writing of the Apostles. The Epistles of the Hebrews remained rejected for a long period. Similarly, the Syrian Church did not acknowledge the second Epistle of Peter, the second and third Epistles of John, the Epistle to Jude, and Revelation. Lardner said in Volume 4 of his commentary on page 175, "Cyrillus and the Church of Jerusalem did not acknowledge the book of Revelation in their period. Apart from this, the name of this book does not even occur in the list of canonical books which he wrote." On page 323 of the same volume he further said, "Revelation was not the part of the Syrian version, but Hebrews and Jacob did not include this book for comments in their commentary. Abed-Jesu omitted the second Epistle of Peter, the second and third Epistles of John, the Epistle of Jude, and the Revelation from his list. All other Syrians have the same opinion about these books." The Catholic Herald of 1844 contains the following statement on page 206 of Volume 7. Rose has written on page 161 of his book that many Protestant scholars consider the book of Revelation non-believable. Professor Ewald has produced powerful arguments to prove that the Gospel of John and the Epistles of John and the Revelations of John cannot be the writings of the same person. Eusebius makes the following statement in chapter 25 of volume 7 of his history. Dionysius says that some ancient writers excluded the book of Revelation from the Holy Scriptures and have completely refuted it. He said that this book is meaningless and a great example of ignorance. Any association of this book with John or with the righteous man or with any Christian is wrong. In fact, this book was attributed to John by a heretic Cerinthus. I wish I had the powers of excluding it from the Holy Scriptures. As far as my own opinion is concerned, I believe it to be from someone who was inspired. But what I cannot easily believe is that the writer was any of the apostles, or that he was the son of Zebedee or brother of Jacob. On the contrary, the idiom of the text and style strongly indicate that the writer cannot have been the Apostle John, who is mentioned in the book of Acts, because his presence in Asia Minor is not known. This John is totally a different man who is an Asian. There are 2 graves in the city of Ephesus, both bearing the inscription of John. The contents and the style of this book indicate that John the Evangelist is not the writer of this book, since the text of the Gospel and the Epistles is as refined as the style of the Greeks. Contrary to this, the book of Revelation contains a text very different in style from the Greeks, full of uncommon expressions. Besides this, the evangelists have a common practice in that they do not disclose their names in the Gospels, nor in the Epistles, but describe themselves in the first person, or in the third person? Which writer of this book has mentioned his own name? In the revelation of Jesus in chapter 1 he says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ which God gave unto him, to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John." He also writes in chapter 4, "John to the 7 churches which are in Asia." In chapter 9 he says, "I, John, who am your brother, and companion in tribulation and in this kingdom, and patience of Jesus Christ." Again in chapter 22 verse 8 he says, "I, John, saw these things and heard them." He mentions his name in all the above verses contrary to the general practice of the evangelists. The explanation that the writer has disclosed his name against his normal practice in order to introduce himself cannot be acceptable, because if this had been his object, he would have used specific words together, with his name defining his intention. For example, he could have written John, the son of Zebedee, or brother of James. He only uses some general words like your brother, companion in patience, etc., which do not serve the purpose of his introduction. Eusebius also says in chapter 3 of volume 3 of his book, "The first epistle of Peter is genuine, but his second epistle should never be included in the Holy Scripture. 14 epistles of Paul are however read. The epistle to the Hebrews has been excluded by some people." He further elaborates in chapter 25 of the same book, "It has been a point of debate whether the epistles to James and Jude, the second epistle of Peter, and the epistles of John 1 and 2 were written by the evangelists or some other writers of the same names. It should be understood that the Acts of Paul, the revelation of Peter, the epistle of Barnabas, and the book entitled The Institution of the Disciples are rejected books, and this can be proved. The revelation should also be included in this list." Eusebius also quotes a statement of Origen concerning the epistle to the Hebrews in chapter 25 of volume 6 of his book. It is a popular notion among the people that this epistle, Hebrews, was written by Clement of Rome within 150 to 220 AD, and some people think that it was written by Luke. The Irish missionary Leon and Hippolytus and Noclus, the missionary of Rome, refused to accept the genuineness of the epistle to Hebrews. Tertullian, the bishop of Carthage, who died in 200 AD, says that this epistle belongs to Barnabas. Caius, the presbyter of Rome, who died in 251 AD, counted 13 epistles of Paul and did not count this epistle. Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, does not make any mention of this epistle. The Monophysite churches still refuse to acknowledge the second epistle of Peter and the second and third epistles of John. Scaliger disowns the epistle to the Hebrews by saying that whoever was the author of this epistle had wasted his time. Eusebius, in chapter 23 of volume 2 of his book, says, "Generally this epistle is supposed to be false, and several ancient writers have mentioned this. Our opinion about the epistle of Jude is not different, but many churches still act according to it. The history of the Bible contains this statement. Grotius says that this epistle, that is, the epistle of Jude, was written by Jude Osculf, the archbishop, the 15th Osculf of Jerusalem, living in the period of Emperor Hadrian." Eusebius has stated in his History volume 6, chapter 25. Origen said in volume 5 of his commentary on the Gospel of John that Paul did not write anything to the churches, and if he wrote to any church, it was not more than a few lines. According to Origen, All the epistles which are attributed to Paul were not written by him. They are hypothetically attributed to him. Perhaps a few lines of Paul might also present in these epistles. Keeping all these statements in mind, we are led to believe the truth of the following statement made by Festus. The author of the New Testament is neither Jesus Christ nor his apostles, but a certain man of unknown identity has written them and attributed them to the evangelists. The truth of this statement has been proved beyond doubt. We have already shown earlier in this book that these 6 epistles and the book of Revelation were believed in and remained rejected up till 363 AD, and they were not acknowledged even by the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Then in 364 AD, the members of the Council of Laodicea acknowledged the 6 epistles. The book of Revelation remained excluded even in this meeting, but later on in 397 AD was acknowledged by the Council of Carthage. The decision of the 2 councils about these cannot be considered as an argument for obvious reasons. Firstly, all the councils had acknowledged the book of Jude. The Council of Laodicea then accepted the 10 verses of chapter 10 from the book of Esther, and the 6 chapters subsequent to chapter 10. The Song of Solomon, Tobit, Baruch, Ecclesiastes, and Maccabees were acknowledged by the Council of Carthage, while all the subsequent councils confirmed the decision of the above 3 councils. Now, if the decisions of these councils were founded on authenticated arguments, which they most certainly were not, then the Protestant would have accepted them. But on the other hand, if their decisions were arbitrary, as was in fact the case, it was necessary for the Protestants to reject all of these books. We are very much surprised to note that they accepted the Council's decisions regarding the 6 epistles as well as the book of Revelation, but rejected it concerning the other books, especially the book of Judith, which had been unanimously acknowledged by the councils. This decision again arbitrary and without justification. Their only proffered reasons, thus the original versions of these books has been lost, cannot be accepted because Jerome confirmed the fact that he found the original versions of Jude and Tobata in the Chaldean language and the original book of Ecclesiasticus in Hebrew, and these books have been translated from the original versions. On this basis, the Protestants should at least accept these books, and they should in fact reject the Gospel of Matthew, since the original of that book was lost. The statement of Horn, already quoted previously, proves the fact that the ancient Christians were not very particular about looking into the authenticity of their traditions. They used to accept and write all kinds of mythical and fabulous stories and traditions which were followed and acted upon by the people of subsequent times. In view of this, the most acceptable conclusion is that the scholars of these councils must have heard some of these traditions, which, after having been rejected for centuries, were acknowledged by them without any authentication. Because the Holy Scriptures are treated by the Christians in the same way as ordinary books of law and civil administration, they continually changed and altered the texts to suit their needs. A few examples of this will be sufficient to establish our claim. The Greek translation was consistently acknowledged as the authoritative text from the time of the Apostles to the 15th century. The Hebrew versions were believed to have been distorted, and the Greek translation was considered the accurate version. Subsequently, the position of these books was altogether changed. The destroyed version was acknowledged as accurate and accurate one as distorted. The Book of Daniel in the Greek version was genuine in the eyes of the early scholars. But after Origen declared that it was incorrect, they rejected it and replaced it with the version of Theodotion. The Epistle of Aristeas remained on the list of the Holy Scriptures, but in the 17th century, some objections were raised against it, and suddenly it turned into a false document in the eyes of all the Protestant scholars. The Latin version is believed genuine by all the Catholics, while it is considered distorted and unbelievable by the Protestants. The small book of Genesis remained genuine and believable up until the 15th century, while the same book was declared false and rejected in the 16th century. The third book of Ezra is still acknowledged by the Greek Church, but has been rejected by both the Catholics and Protestants. Similarly, the Song of Solomon was considered genuine, a part of the Holy Scriptures, and can still be found in the Codex Alexandrine, yet it is now rejected. The gradual realization of the distortions present in a number of their holy books is bound to lead the Christians, sooner or later, to admit to the truth of the fact that the great parts of the Judeo-Christian scriptures have undergone great changes and distortions. We have shown that the Christians do not possess any authentic records or acceptable arguments for the authenticity of the books of either the Old Testament or the New Testament. End of Part 1. The Books of the Bible. In Izharul Haq, The Truth Revealed, written by Maulana M. Rahmatullah Kairanvi.